Happy Halloween, and welcome to this special of Let's H. I'm recording this intro because I found a lengthy review of American Horror Story Coven that I did last year in December 2014. I'd never finished cleaning it up, and at the time I didn't know quite as much as I do now about audio editing and post-production. I'm by no means a master now, but I know a lot more than I did then, and I also tend to use better equipment than I did then. I thought it would be nice to record my thoughts because at the time of the review, my memories were very fresh about the series. I'd just watched it, so it's not only a break in the American Horror Story hotel reviews, but also a special Halloween event. I give to you Let's H, American Horror Story Coven. Enjoy and have a wonderful, magical, happy Halloween. Thanks again for tuning in as always. Please subscribe, follow my stuff, and follow on social media. Think about becoming a patron on Patreon if you really like what I do. Thanks again. American Horror Story Coven. It's the third season of the American Horror Story series. As with previous seasons, each season tells a complete story of its own. It starts off serviceable, if somewhat inane in certain ways. Essentially, Coven is X-Men, but with witches. For some reason, the house is called an academy where they go, yet they never have any classes, don't seem to care about students coming and going as they please, and seem to provide everyone with their own personal cars. Why not just call it a shelter or something if there's literally nothing educational going on there? I don't know, and apparently neither did the writers. It's that sort of X-Men comic booky feel to it that leads to some very bad because I said so storytelling that was not original enough to really be pulled off. Similarly to labeling a fairly generic house an academy, death is another term that has absolutely no meaning in the story. Someone dies and they become a spirit. However, spirits can just arbitrarily interact with the physical world of the living exactly as they please. There's no real difficulty and there's no reason not to be a spirit. It puzzles me why some characters do become spirits and have this sort of way of interacting and others don't. And it's generally viewed as not something to do, to be dead, but what's the problem? No one who's actually dead in the series seems to really mind it as long as they're a spirit. It's these heavy-handed elements that are applied inconsistently across the board, yet when they are applied, such as this, it makes you wonder why anyone gets really that worked up over characters dying. If they can just pretty much hang around and do the same as they did when they were alive, and not have to worry about anything else, what's the big deal? I don't quite understand that. Of course, we've got characters who have a power to bring people back from the dead as well, but that's problematic too, as we'll see. The main character from the first episode, we are to assume, is named Zoe. I called her Rogue because she is basically that same sort of X-Men role. She's taken to a school, this academy for witches, when she accidentally murders a dude because she has a killer vagina. Yes, a killer vagina. This aspect of her plot is almost entirely dropped after she kills the dude with it somehow in the worst hospital in the world. It's never explained how her family, who claim that sometimes inherit this trait, how they procreate exactly, and it's also never explained why they were so okay with her accidentally murdering a dude and took absolutely no precautions to make sure she wouldn't if they knew that this was a possibility. Unlike some of the other powers that pop up during the series, this is something no one else in the series ever mentions having, despite the fact that witches are supposed to develop an assortment of powers and eventually are supposed to be able to assert a certain number of specific powers that seem to be shared by everyone involved. The Supreme is supposed to have access to all of these powers, so this would be one of those powers that would kind of, suck to have, but no one else is ever implied to have this ability, and it's not really made clear what they intend to do with Zoe's ability. Shoehorned, meaningless romance appears in the first episode, and it really has to be back-built. Clearly the writers didn't think it was convincing enough, and indeed it wasn't. They repeatedly try to back-build reasons for us to care about the dude that dies and who gets horribly brought back by two very irresponsible young witches who, yet again, no one seems to have overseen, no one seems to have chaperoned. Essentially, this is the worst school ever. Not only is it not really a school, they don't actually learn anything, and we never see them training in any way, but there's no accountability. No one looks after them. Despite the fact that one of them can kill people by having sex with them, another can hurt or kill people by using her own body as basically a voodoo doll, yet another is telepathic. I mean, there is just so much here. It would be like if, to use the X-Men parallel again, Professor Xavier assembled his team and then just sort of fucked off and did whatever he wanted to do, and never once actually trained them or bothered to teach them anything. It's about as much of a school as that would be. So we get this dude named Kyle, who is brought back from the dead after a very bad bus accident. We don't actually care about him or any of the people that he's with, though, because they were basically a bunch of dude bro, frat boy rapists. The only reason why we care about Kyle is because of that shoehorned in romance that we are supposed to assume is romantic, but we only got the blandest amount of interaction. It's possibly because Zoe's actress is not very good with the material, but there's also not a lot in the material for her to work with. So that coming together of not the best actress ever and not the best material ever made it just seem like a casual interaction at a party. We didn't really care about anyone, and we don't really care about the guy that died because he was only on the screen for 5 minutes. He's not that big of a loss, but unfortunately, the writers thought that they needed to backbuild his story. Oh dear, there's a clear confusion about Power Ray in the very beginning as well. This character named Misty Day, and take in the name, Misty Day, is implied to be part of the resurrection of Kyle, whom I will call Frankenbro from now on because it's easier to remember. Incantations and ritual are necessary at this first part, but later it's like they pretty much forget about it. They occasionally pop in, but it's not a big part of things, and they don't seem to really care. They also had Misty, whose main power is essentially bringing back people from the dead and healing with swamp mud or alligator poop or something. Their story changes from episode to episode, as does the explanation as to why it works. This is just part of the inconsistency that Coven presents. The necessities for performing magic and doing these things come and go with the writer. At the earlier episodes, it was easy to assume that each witch had a specific power, but only the Supreme had multiple powers that she could draw on that were basically everyone's power that she could use. The incantations and rituals could be easily assumed to be something that you would use if you couldn't do it with your own power, but it would take more effort and more energy, and possibly might even take deals with the devil, because they mention Azazel in the resurrection spell. So why is it that none of the characters ever bring up dealing with demons, devils, or any other sort of supernatural entities ever again? Could it be that they wasted their entire budget on getting Stevie Nicks for glorified cameos and music videos and singing the wrong words to her old songs, and couldn't afford anybody but the actor to do that Papa Legba guy? He was not Papa Legba. It seems a bit odd that there was a mention of that. There was the mention of Azazel in the resurrection spell that they used for Frankenbro, and yet, well, that's never mentioned again. It's never mentioned again. It's dropped completely after that episode. Even the resurrection spell is never mentioned again because you have Misty Day who can just bring back people from the dead as she pleases. Kind of weird. Also kind of irresponsible of the writers. Why can't the characters go to demons instead of the embarrassing not Papa Legba, as is tried later? It would have made it scarier and darker, as well as given the witches more of an edge. But they just basically had, as I said before, X-Men as witches, which turned into everyone is essentially power nexus. Why exactly does that happen? It doesn't really make any sense. And it would have been a much more interesting dynamic to have Marie dealing with her voodoo deities, spirits and loas, and the witches dealing with, demons and devils and all these other things. I mean, if we're going to do a scary show about witches, at least have something like that in it. Now, I know most real-life witches don't tend to deal with demons, devils, etc. But as this is American Horror Story, why are we not having horror elements in here? Why don't we have horror elements like deals with demons or devils or whatnot? It doesn't seem to me like most of the characters would balk at doing that. They would just, take it as a matter of fact. But it was like they were trying to be daring, but they didn't really want to be actually daring. The opening intro sequence is pretty much as daring as it gets, and the only real part of the series to even pull off that level of edgy and creepy. Cordelia, whom we are supposed to view as the headmistress sort of this school, is an insulting character who revolves around resenting her mother and shitting out kids. We're supposed to care about this, but we don't, because the actress is not good enough to convey it, and the material is terrible and inconsistent. You can tell that Sarah Paulson is trying, but yet again, this is a coming together of not the best actress ever and not the best material ever. In fact, it's terrible material, and the acting is awful and wooden. You don't really care about this character because she's basically a horrible cardboard cutout of a female character. She's not a strong female character by any means, but she's not even the kind of character who, in her weakness or frailty, manages to be a distinct character. She just ends up looking like a pastiche of other characters that you didn't like and didn't care about. She doesn't even manage to achieve soap opera levels of compelling or conveying any sort of emotion, feeling, or eliciting sympathy from the audience. Coincidentally, she completely forgets about her obsession with pregnancy almost immediately and never brings it up again. I understand having issues with your parents because I, and most people have experienced that. Most people, I would say, would find it a sympathetic element of a character that they are constantly at odds with their parents, and that they at times resent the decisions of one or the other of their parents who may have left them in a very bad situation. I understand that, but just banking on that alone and not really thinking about the fact that the situation is not sympathetic is very bad writing. It wasn't handled well at all, and only makes Cordelia look horrible, because, well, she is. Remarkably, almost every bad thing that happens in the series can be traced directly back to Cordelia. If she ceased to exist, or never existed in the first place, virtually nothing bad that happens during the series would have happened. She's the accidental villain of the series. Delphine is dug up, and despite supposedly trying to keep her presence secret, as usual no precautions are taken at all, not even bathing her and offering her a change of clothes from the one she's been wearing for 180 years. This is like when they were supposedly hiding Madison from Fiona, and Madison was just chilling on the steps in the main room of the house. How do they think that this is going to go down? How do they think they're going to pull this off? If you were really trying to hide the presence of someone who had been locked in a coffin for almost 200 years, the first thing you would do is say, okay, we're getting a change of clothes and you're going to wash. People who came to the door could smell her. Other people in the school could hear her thoughts. It didn't make any sense for this to be the way it was. Someone as intelligent as Fiona would not have realistically overlooked those things, especially since she was trying to use it as a bargaining chip. Queenie and Delphine end up having kind of a bond that is the only meaningful and positive character development they have. It ends up being surprisingly touching and gives the characters depth. Naturally, it's thrown out, only a couple of episodes later, for absolutely no reason, and the characters take sharp turns into different people. This is something that really bothered me because while Queenie was not the most compelling of characters up to that point, and while Delphine was obviously a horrible human being, the fact that their characters came together and started to advance is a sign of good writing. It's the kind of writing that really should have been throughout Coven. We didn't ultimately care about most of the characters because they didn't develop. They didn't develop into anything more than what they were at the beginning. Every time anything happened, they got reset to the way that they always were. And that is not really good writing. That doesn't make people compelled to watch more. When you have someone who actually develops and becomes a better person or even a worse person, it's at least some change in their character, some development, some evolution of that character. That is what we watch drama for, not for the characters that have some sort of promise of advancement and are not adequate characters as is, but then just get reset to that inadequate basic placeholder that they were in the beginning. You can have a character who doesn't change and who is basically an interesting character that is compelling. A character can still develop without drastic changes in their personality. If Delphine had become a worse person than she was before, if it were handled organically and believably, it would have been interesting. If you had had Queenie become a worse person than she was before in an organic way, it would have become interesting. However, both characters take sharp left turns, and all of that development is completely blown away. Both characters do become less likable, but that's because they're less real and they're less interesting. They just become assholes with no real motivation behind what they do, and suddenly they find themselves espousing very strong sentiments that were not really indicated before, or, if they were part of the character at the beginning, ages ago, when the story itself started, and all of the development is completely wiped away. That's not good storytelling. Even if a character returns to the way that they were before, even if they return to bad ways of thinking that they espoused before, there's got to be a compelling reason for the audience to care about that. It's got to be something that draws them in to investing in this character, in all these characters, and the circumstances surrounding them. Queenie also may or may not have transferred her sexual advances on Minotaur Dude to him. How does that work? She doesn't have a penis, at least presumably, so chalk this up to another really poorly defined power set and an extremely awkward sequence that I don't think was well thought out. Marie, supposedly Marie Laveau Voodoo Queen, runs a hole-in-the-wall salon, despite being alive for over 200 years. It's sobering to realize that Fiona was completely right in her criticism of Marie, who apparently not only can't invest well, but also, as we see later, has on-again, off-again magical powers and literally cannot tell dead people from living ones. Not that there's much difference, admittedly, since ghosts, as previously mentioned, can apparently just interact with the living world whenever and however they want to. The treaty that Marie obsesses over between witches and the voodoo people is also ill-defined and as vague as anything else in this show. There's a problematic claim, which may just be Marie coming off as racist, which is about par for the course for this show, seems to imply that all witchcraft came from Tituba. Tituba was important, as anyone who's read Arthur Miller's The Crucible could tell you, but witchcraft existed for centuries before Tituba, before America, before the African slave trade. It's just tossed in, seemingly to draw more race-based lines between the characters that are arbitrary and kind of offensive. Frankenbro has repeated attempts to backbuild his story, as I mentioned before, into basically what amounts to some sort of saint. His mother gets a completely over-the-top development, which, in an attempt to make Frankenbro sympathetic or pitiable, only ends up making Zoe look like a horrible moronic bitch. When his mother is murdered in a completely unexpected turn of events, they don't bother hiding the act at all, and in fact hang around the house for what is clearly several hours, if not more than a day. This is extremely problematic. Even if you don't think someone else would notice, even if you're assuming that this woman didn't have friends or relations that would check on her, it seems very odd, especially in the fact that she lives in a neighborhood that is clearly populated, as we can see, and there are people running around in costumes. It's kind of odd because at no time during the series does the foliage match what's going on, and certainly the costumes don't match it either. If you weren't aware up to now, Cordelia acts very high and mighty, but seems not to care at all about the students coming and going as they please. As I've mentioned, one of the students is a movie star and instantly recognizable, and one of them, as I mentioned before, has the unfortunate killer vagina. If they're trying to avoid attention, which is repeatedly mentioned that it's not a good idea for witches to be out in the open, maybe they could spend more time taking an interest in the comings and goings of their wards, at least at more times than when they just feel like it or suddenly find it to be important to them. That's kind of not what being the head of a school is about. It's no wonder that they don't have any students to speak of anymore. Madison has an I can't feel subplot that lasts about an episode and is completely forgotten about, along with the makeup that was supposed to make her look undead. This is yet another one of several subplots that ultimately don't really go anywhere, and it's a shame because some of them actually would serve to develop a character more. If Madison couldn't feel and kept being unable to feel, it would add a layer of dimension to the character that would make her not just the bitchy one, or the bitchy sort of famous hedonistic one. Madison actually has a lot of levels to her character anyway, and because she is the bitchy character, we're clearly supposed to dislike her. What happened actually is that most of the time she's the most sensible of all of them. Even when she's being unpleasant, you can't really blame her because everyone around her is either stupid, an asshole, or completely doesn't care. It's made clear that Frankenbro actually still has his intellect, but he has to relearn how to express himself. Zoe ignores this not once, not twice, but several times after seeming to understand, and keeps plying him with kindergarten-level learning shit. Eventually he's able to communicate better, but whether or not that has anything to do with her and her efforts, it's dubious, because he clearly has his intellect still, and he expresses this to her really obviously. Zoe, you're an asshole. There's also a love triangle between the two formerly dead people and Zoe that they all seem okay with, but then suddenly they're not. Surprise, surprise, this is like something they'd put on the CW. If you want to put soap opera level interactions in, at least do it in a mature way. It's really an interesting dynamic to have three people in a relationship, even if it is generally a purely sexual one. The thing is, when you start to deal with it in a tawdry way like that, like, oh, he's mine, oh no, he's mine, it objectifies one character and puts the other two characters at two ends of a spectrum. That's not really something that makes a character seem deeper and more nuanced. In fact, it makes a character seem more shallow, and that's exactly what happens here. Madison is clearly in the right, as usual, and Zoe is an asshole. So, when you have the two that cannot work together and have to clash, you're basically asking for the audience to side with one of them. The prize is whomever they're fighting for, which is extremely insulting. But there is also, along with the weird kind of uncomfortably racist elements of this show, some extremely uncomfortable sexist elements of the show. And it's not just sexist against men, it's sexist against women. There are some really distressing elements of the show that it seems like they weren't intending to be like this, but it was so ineptly done it couldn't help but be insulting. And speaking of insulting, the Academy get new neighbours who are embarrassing stereotypes. Of course, they're fundamentalist Christians, and of course they're vile human beings who, like many other characters in this series, say and do things that no real person actually has ever said or done in the history of ever. Like, you end up having no sympathy for them whatsoever, because not only are they terrible characters and poorly written, the, yet again, uncomfortably incestuous overtones. The mother does things that we're supposed to find humiliating to her son, but which would literally kill him. Like, they forget about this in the same episode, but it's played as over the top, but it would literally kill him. And this is never mentioned. This is never mentioned. He doesn't have any real reactions to it. There's nothing detrimental that happens until he gets shot, which is ridiculous. Honestly, the less said about them, the better. Patti LuPone is a great actress, but this was a waste of her. It's yet another subplot that goes absolutely nowhere. Like, the show would not be affected in the slightest by cutting them out completely. It seemed like they only did this to have a storyline for Nan before booting her out like old bathwater because they also couldn't figure out what to do with her. Yet another inconsistency in dealing with death. Okay, so Marie, after sending her pet Minotaur to maybe kill people at the school, decides to raise a zombie army after they sent the head back to her. The head was still moving too, so it's likely that it was still alive and she could have just fixed the thing. And they don't think about sending out Delphine to stop the zombies. She can't die, that's kind of her thing. It's a ridiculous storyline that is a neat idea but is completely misused. It's a total waste of time. A zombie army would be a really neat story. It should have taken like a whole episode. That would have been fantastic. But it was just bits and pieces. They didn't even spend much time under siege by the zombies, and there weren't that many of them, obviously. You could see on the screen there just weren't that many. Why couldn't they just get some extras? Surely people would not mind being on television and being a zombie. Zombies are hot, they will always be hot. I just don't understand how yet again a promising plot development, a promising aspect of a plot, has failed. They have completely failed in conveying it. They've completely wasted the time with it, and it's gone nowhere. It ultimately has gone nowhere. They've completely flubbed it. They have not used it even remotely well. Council of Witchcraft are brought into the story after this. They've been mentioned a couple of times, and Myrtle has even appeared in the first episode, even though she had maybe a handful of lines and disappeared as quickly. But the council seem to be marvellously superfluous. If the Supreme can do anything and everything, why do we even need a council in the first place? Especially since they're willing to burn someone at the stake based on completely circumstantial evidence. And they know there is someone at the school that can do things, as makes that evidence. So why exactly is it they're willing to believe the first and flimsiest evidence that they receive? Like everyone else in this series, they can't seem to be bothered to look into a situation and get the whole story. This is sort of a recurring motif. People ask about things, or they try and magic out things, and when they find one aspect of the story but not the circumstances or anything else going on with it, oh, they're all ready to react to it, usually by killing someone, which is ridiculous. They shoehorn in a man, who is of course a camp gay man, as if to say that men are involved in witchcraft too. But the whole witch hunter subplot later, and the treatment of Kyle up to now, is a larger effort, and more sexist and offensive. It would seem to indicate a gender-based conflict that they were trying desperately to present here. The hospital is also, as I mentioned before, the worst hospital in the world. But see, it's inconsistent. In one scene, it's some kind of Silent Hill Memorial Hospital with shit on the floor and flickering fluorescent lights, and no security where someone can just randomly walk in on a woman who just gave birth. There's also this weird thing the show seems to be obsessed with, which is showing a bloody mess on the sheets that for some reason isn't cleaned up. Of course, an orderly barges in later in the same episode to threaten Fiona and Hank with ejection, despite the fact that their conversation was surely not audible outside of the room. Good thing the staff have priorities. And of course later on, when you go back to this hospital, it's spick and span and looks new and beautiful. And then later on you get the Silent Hill version. Maybe this was supposed to be like Silent Hill and phase in between levels of reality, but honestly I don't think I'll give them that much credit. If there has ever been a character with cornier dialogue than the Axeman, I have never seen one. His romance with Fiona is not only incredibly creepy, but it also feels forced and arbitrary, like they couldn't find anything else to do with the character for a while. He's also an insane serial killer, and he's never developed to the level of being truly more than a pastiche. It's only due to a very decent portrayal by his actor that we even care about him at all. He manages to deliver these corny lines as if they really mean something to him, and that's actually a pretty big triumph for acting, especially with a character who has as bad material as everybody else in Coven. Queenie's character development is abandoned with "because I said so" writing that has her alleging that the other girls don't like her. There has never been any remote indication of this. In fact, she and Nan appear to be the best of friends. She's been more of a bitch than Madison, if you want to get down to it, and they all seem to be okay with it. Everybody's kind of an asshole at Miss Rubbershow's Academy. It's insulting, though, and yet again an uncomfortably racist-feeling development that Queenie suddenly feels the need to go to Marie and talk with her about possibly leaving the Academy and betraying what they're doing. It's also troubling that she can't perceive that she's being clearly and obviously used by a woman whom we have seen absolutely no indication is even remotely trustworthy. She's had development with Delphine and Delphine with her. However, there has never been the slightest of contact between her and Marie, and no reason why she would feel like she wanted to go to Marie and convey this to her. Surely there were other people and other places she could have gone. While Queenie is turned into a different character, Delphine's development is completely abandoned and what amounts to rolled back. It's nothing less than a tragedy. Delphine has been the opposite of Marie at this point in the story, a character that shows real development as a person. She's a horrible person with an atrocious past, but she's changing and learning as a character, which makes her interesting and gives the audience something to watch for and cheer for. Marie, on the other hand, has experienced her share of tragedy and abuse, but she doesn't learn from it and doesn't change as a character at all. She's exactly the same person she was 200 years ago, if not worse. This contrast makes a character that we should find compelling, interesting, and positive to be someone we don't like, don't trust, and see as negative. Delphine, by far, is a better and more nuanced character than Marie at this point. It's horrible to say this because Delphine is a racist mass murderer who committed horrible acts of atrocity in her time. However, she's changing as a character and developing with another character and with her interactions with the rest of the cast. Unfortunately, all of this is for nothing, as so much in Coven is. From this point, they have no idea what to do with Queenie or Delphine, and the characters change what they're doing, how they act, and what their motivations are not only between episodes, but sometimes in the same episode. And now, as if it weren't bad enough, they've decided to introduce a subplot. Yes, this subplot was indicated before now, and involved the cardboard cutout husband of Cordelia. If we didn't care about Cordelia, We certainly don't care about her idiot husband. However, he's involved with a group of witch hunters. Apparently, some hillbillies run a super rich corporation somehow, or something, that for some reason wants to wipe out witches. But see, the thing is, we're never really given any indication as to why. They've never given any motivation to these witch hunters. It's like they read those same X-Men comics that I keep referring to and decided that, well, since they ripped off the rest of it, they needed an analog for the Friends of Humanity or the Sentinels or something. It's really dumb. The whole organization is never really fleshed out that much, and we don't really understand why they're doing what they're doing. All it makes them seem like is a bunch of superheroes, which is kind of tracing back to the comic thing. Essentially, they're just cartoonish villains. They don't really have any motivation for doing what they're doing, or at least none that we're aware of at this point, and they don't make any effort to give them any. They're nothing but characters to hate and to give a cheer when they're finally defeated. This leads to an incredibly offensive sequence with Hank mass murdering people at Marie's salon, cut with real footage of real people suffering. This raises so many questions, and it makes Marie seem like the worst character in the show for constantly endangering innocents and not giving a flying fuck. Cordelia is just as bad, though. This is one of the things that are most regrettable about the show, because Cordelia is comparable, even if she's not quite as bad as Marie's character has become. Marie also apparently has no protective wards around her seat of power, nor is she suddenly able to do anything on spur of the moment. When confronted with someone who has the obvious intent to murder her, all she can do is stare blankly across a room and make no attempt, magical or non-magical, to stop him or to defend herself. How odd. And how abrupt. Of course, as I've said before, the writing is so inconsistent with this show that people that have this power one time will have a different power the next time, or maybe they have another power, or maybe they don't have any power they can use at all. This also happens later, in the last 2 episodes I refuse to admit exist, with Cordelia suddenly and effortlessly manifesting all of the powers, despite the fact that everybody else had to do it gradually. The witch hunters clearly have existed for some time, and the witches know of them, yet Cordelia married one. Okay, fair enough, Cordelia's not sharpest stick in the bunch, but what Marie and Fiona did, with Fiona basically at the ebb of her power, in an afternoon destroyed their organization. It took them all of half an hour to figure out who the witch hunters were. Why did they not do this sooner? I'd slap Cordelia too if it were that easy to figure out. Of course, that whole subplot is completely tied up and goes absolutely nowhere, so it might as well not have even existed because it only ends up damaging the overarching story. All this effort is put into giving the witches outside antagonists, but they're completely unnecessary and only ruin the focus of the narrative. They're also offensively uninspired, and their stories go absolutely nowhere at all. The witch hunters were literally almost the only people besides the witches themselves that were killing other witches. So why exactly was it that they were convinced witches were dying? When Fiona was young, we see a huge number of witches at the academy. That wasn't so long ago, because Cordelia really did suck at running it. And speaking of suck, I have to deal with it at some point. Stevie Nicks has a glorified cameo in an embarrassingly named episode where she pretends to act and seems to have forgotten the words to her own songs. Then she repurposes a song she wrote for a romantic partner's dead daughter. If you thought this was a useless, worthless cameo appearance by a celebrity who should have known better, you were correct. By the point that this happens, though, we're abundantly aware that Cordelia, as I have said before, is completely and absolutely worthless. At this point, you just don't care. Shouldn't someone be able to bring back the people who died? You just don't care. With a better actress, it might have actually been something we could at least find interesting. But with her cardboard cutout delivery, it just makes her annoying. She's a flat character whose defining moment was pitching a baby tantrum in her greenhouse. The most fulfilling moment in the entire series is where Fiona pimp slaps her. I am not even kidding about this. I actually cheered. The whole last 3 episodes or so aren't even worth talking about. They're that awful. It's like they figured out they wasted so much time with irrelevant crap that they had to rush and tie up the plot. And they still introduced new plot points. If you're bored or sad enough to watch these 3 last episodes, You can't help but wonder about the arbitrary use of power and restriction of power, and the fact that the writing was so bad that they actually had to take characters out or have them not be somewhere close so that the audience, they probably thought, wouldn't think about them just undoing it. And if the Supreme can do anything at all, why exactly didn't she just fix everything? And why exactly is it that, even though her power is ebbing, the outgoing Supreme couldn't just fix things? Why exactly is it that, if being dead and being brought back from death cured Madison's heart murmur, Fiona couldn't do the same for herself, or any other character with a condition for that matter? This is never explained. I mean, maybe the Supreme fixed everything post-series. I can only hope so. But it would have been nice if she'd set things right instead of displaying her usual lackadaisical, irresponsible attitudes where she never cares about anyone but herself. Madison threatening to expose the witches, likewise, would have been a much more interesting plot than the witch hunter shit or the Bible thumper neighbours, yet it's a throwaway couple of scenes that ends up with Frankenborough killing her. But she had the power to bring back people from the dead. Misty resurrected herself with it several times. So that really solved absolutely nothing. And then Cordelia makes a fucking TV advert and exposes witches anyway. What the fuck? It's directly implied that Madison exposing witches would be this horrible thing that they've got to prevent, but then they decide to do it anyway? What the fuck sense does that make? Also, I know it's a school for girls, but maybe it's time to amend that, since apparently the only witchcraft school they ever refer to exists. Even if they don't teach classes, ever, or train the girls in any meaningful way during the series. But if there are male and female witches out there, doesn't this kind of imply that there are at least 1/3 of their potential student body who are male witches that have no guidance or protection? Sucks to be them, I guess. Thanks, Cordelia. Essentially, Coven is a series of 13 episodes, yet has a revolving creative team which makes it inconsistent and incoherent. It comes off like none of them actually knew what the others were writing for their episodes, and as a result, plot points played up as important are abandoned and forgotten about, and characters are different people between one episode and the next. It's also really a bad idea to use music to fish for plots, because all you end up with is embarrassing silliness. While it was very neat to have a music video style intro for the final episode, the intro, as usual, was the only good thing about it. And even it didn't make sense, as Stevie had no reason for being there and was apparently strolling about the house singing with full accompaniment, then interacted with the girls in the middle of this music video and abruptly left. It was embarrassing because it could have been neat, the imagery was very neat, and it really showed a great side of the house itself that wasn't shown in any of the other episodes. Was the direction that bad? Was there just not a good idea of photography or set dressing? I don't know, but that sequence was the only one that showed the house as being remotely interesting or well photographed. But it's fine to be inspired by songs. It's just that this became a desperate bid for story elements from them. It was surprising we didn't end up with Silver Springs or some magical tusk, and it's nothing short of miraculous that we didn't have a plot surrounding a tome called the Book of Love. You can't do that in story writing and expect it to go well without working at it, and the Coven group really didn't work at it. They were inconsistent, it was round-robin storytelling, and it's like nobody else listened to the previous part. Nothing means anything. Absolutely nothing, and the story goes nowhere from the first episode to the last. Nothing meaningful changes with any of the characters, and it's completely predictable even if you don't try. The characters are, well, as previously mentioned, inconsistent at best. Zoe, whom I call Rogue, is the most half-assed witch I've ever seen. She's almost as wooden as Cordelia and Hank, but not quite there. She half-asses everything, and this becomes a huge problem because she keeps doing it. So many of the plot situations that are problematic or threatening occur directly because she half-asses everything, or she didn't think through something before doing it. Also, keep in mind that she does things that they have burnt people, literally burnt people alive to death for, and doesn't give it a second thought. She also has no real consequences of anything she does, and her motivations change at the drop of a hat. Maybe they were trying to go for realism, but I have never known anyone who is in their right mind whose motivations change as quickly as hers do. She has no end of stupid ideas. She doesn't think any of them through, and no one is willing, apparently, to stop her. Where are the responsible adults in this? It's like they just forget she exists. And while it's easy to do because she's such a boring, unlikable character, it doesn't really add to the realism of the situation, and it doesn't make it more suspenseful because we don't care about her. She's a complete hypocrite about everything, most especially killing. She never bothers to give the whole story. She half-asses it, as always, in her investigations, and once she has one element of what happened, but not how it happened or the circumstances surrounding it, she's ready to kill someone for it. Great idea. The only neat thing about her is when she fought zombies with a chainsaw. That's literally the only interesting thing she does in the entire story. Her deadly vagina power is never really explored, no pun intended, and such a power is interesting and tragic, but it just ends up being like Rogue of the X-Men. Instead of not being able to touch people, she can't have vaginal sex with them. While this may not be a deal breaker for everyone, it certainly would affect some people, many people, even most people, I'd say. And when you're a teenager, like Zoe is supposed to be, I'm sure it would be kind of a bummer. So it's kind of weird how we never really get more development of that. No, really, ever. Past the second episode, you never really hear it much. I'll close my section of Zoe by saying every time she was on the screen or tried to say something and managed to fuck it up, I was reminded of the horrible attempt at a southern accent the actress in the X-Men films gave Rogue. I would always say, "I saved your life," because in a way that really kind of epitomizes her character. And, well, it was a lot more interesting than what they actually gave her to say. Queenie is an unfortunate character. The sum of her characterization is the fat one, then it's shifted to the Witch of Colour. I really wish we could have seen her be something really great and meaningful, because there is so little representation of people of size on anything. They even played with replacing love with food with her and gave her some sort of an explanation, some sort of a motivation behind who she was and why she was the person that she was. But this went nowhere. This went absolutely nowhere and ended up having absolutely no bearing on who she became. She changes motivations like the weather, and she's even willing, stupidly, to trust someone like Marie, and only ends up going back to the academy after everyone is basically dead at Marie's place, and Marie has pretty much abandoned her because she apparently can't tell the difference between living people and dead ones. She didn't even try to help the people that may have been just injured and not dead in her salon. What an asshole. Queenie also claims things that haven't been supported by the narrative. They just come out of nowhere. It's like she invents these things and doesn't really think about the reasoning behind them. Yes, it is kind of teenager-like, but when you're dealing with an actual narrative, it's very irresponsible to have it be something like a character claims something and it hasn't even been built up or even introduced up to now. Either we should feel like it is her making up shit, or we should feel like it is legitimate. But nothing was built either way. So we must assume she's making up shit, which damages her character, especially since she's willing to put other characters in mortal danger of their lives because of her irresponsible decisions. Her powers are very nebulous and puzzling. It isn't ever very clear when her voodoo doll ability works and when it doesn't. Sometimes people can hurt her, sometimes they can't. Sometimes whatever she does to herself is transferred to someone else, sometimes they aren't. How exactly does it work? We don't know. It's never really explained. And that's really a shame, especially in the case of the weird sort of rapey encounter with the Minotaur, which would have been more interesting if we had known what she was doing, how she did it, and what she was aiming for. The episode, in fact, implied that Queenie was just looking for love and acceptance, and substituting the love that she didn't get with food, which was her only true love because, well, she couldn't get that affection from other people. Her suddenly trying to connect with the Minotaur, which is a creature that would have been great throughout the series instead of just in 2 or 3 episodes, was kind of sensible in the context of the episode. But as those elements were completely thrown out afterwards, and the Minotaur never pops up again, we never got to see her develop with more than just Delphine. She never develops with Marie, she never develops with anyone else, and when she does change, she turns into a different character. It's not logical or organic, it's nothing that she gave any indication of wanting to do before. Madison is supposed to be the bitch character we hate, but she actually tends to be more logical and reasonable than most of the others. She's surrounded by irresponsible assholes, so why should she be kind to them? She's a movie star and, well, maybe she's let her first celebrity get to her, but she really just has the impression of not caring. The episode where she gets to give the voiceover and we learn a bit more about her makes her seem like a much more compelling character than any of the other young witches, and she actually has more personality than any of them either, which may just be the actress doing a very good job with material that just really wasn't that good. She does a good job of making it compelling, even though none of the young witches are really that great. Even Madison is really not able to get beyond the fact that they had these young witches around in what I must assume to be an attempt to be X-Men, but they never actually managed to make them have any sense for being around or justify them being around. It wasn't a school, they never learned anything, and the people that run the school never really cared about them. If they had wiped out the entire number of young witches from the show, it wouldn't have really changed it much, except maybe to make it better. The older witches are much more interesting aside from Cordelia. Even a show with just Fiona and Marie sniping back and forth at each other and the change of the dynamic would be more interesting. But getting back to Madison, the reason why we don't really hate her is because we don't like anyone else either. She's given very little opportunity to develop as a character, but the one real time that they give her something to do, which is to lament the fact that she can't seem to feel anything since being brought back from the dead, it's basically thrown out almost immediately and never mentioned again. She is, however, portrayed by a far superior actress to Rogue. I saved your life. Let me just say that again. Nan is an underused character, and it kind of seems like they just really didn't know what to do with her. It's a shame because the actress isn't bad, but it seems like they just introduced her to have a character like hers and then didn't think that they could do anything with her. It's kind of insulting to the actress, and it's also insulting to the character to think that all she could ever do was sit around and act put out or make some goofy comment every now and then. She wasn't even a good supporting character, though, and her single storyline was woefully terrible and transparent and flimsy. It would have been better if it had never even happened, but then we wouldn't care about the character getting killed off, which also didn't make sense. She exists to be pitied, which is a shame because this could have been for once a different type of role for this kind of character. It seems like this sort of character always exists to be pitied, always exists to be put upon, and always exists for something terrible to happen to them. She's still stupid with regards to motivation, although at least hers are consistent, probably because she only gets one story she factors into in any way whatsoever. The rather comically named Misty Day is a fan of Stevie Nicks. No, really, that's her entire character. She threatens her killers with fire initially, as you hear, but then she completely forgets that, despite it being something that would potentially have developed her. She has an arbitrary, undefined power just like the rest, and it comes and goes. Once they've introduced this character, however, they keep having to find reasons for her not to be there or not to interact with anyone else. They even give her a ridiculous cat fight with Madison, which is not only implausible, but insulting and takes way too long to happen. None of what happens makes any sense, and Misty is one of the most ill-defined, flimsy characters ever. It says something for her actress's portrayal that she's able to put in so much as she is. Also, she's probably the only one in the show, other than Fiona, to have a believable southern accent. Myrtle, who is a character I really liked, is a quirky fashionista witch. She has a hastily back-built story which isn't always consistent with itself. She's an amusing character, but she has virtually no development. Every time that they add something about her, they take something away. She's also absent for most of the series, so when she actually does start hanging around, it seems almost weird and like she doesn't quite fit with the rest of the characters, and indeed she really kind of doesn't. She exists to have someone for Cordelia to relate to, But at the same time, as we don't care about Cordelia, it just ends up being annoying that she has to spend so much time with a character we don't like instead of getting her own development as her own character. Fiona, despite being the assumed villain, is the best character in the show, hands down. She should have had a better resolution, or never had it go beyond woman losing her looks. This is an interesting enough premise that would have led to plenty of development for her character. It really didn't need to go to the level that it did about the whole Supreme, because that just makes the whole witch society seem regrettable and stupid. It also makes them seem like failures if they can't help their Supreme, and once a new Supreme ascends, it seems assy of that Supreme not to do something for the old Supreme. This is another instance of where antagonists outside the witches seem utterly superfluous. They seem completely extraneous. They don't even need to be there, because the witches are their own worst enemies in this series, which really undermines any sort of feminine strength or strong female characters in it. The romance with Axeman is ludicrous, and it's like the show knows it, but he's not really given a consistent anything to do between episodes because, as I've said, the writing is completely and utterly inconsistent. She runs hot and cold towards Cordelia, depending on the episode. Some episodes, she hates her. Other episodes, she loves her and wants to reunite with her. Fiona is, despite all the inconsistencies, far more interesting than any other character. And part of this, I would venture to say, is because of Jessica Lange's superb portrayal. She's one of the best actors in the series, as well as being a profoundly talented actress in general. We are literally only cheering for Fiona to the point where, when she plans to kill all the others, we're okay with that, because they're assholes. Fiona may be kind of an asshole too, but at least she's a compelling asshole that develops and is a character that we would like to be, rather than a character that we would like to kill. Marie is one of those that is problematically based on a real person. This doesn't typically end well, especially if that real person is kind of obviously different from what they were trying to convey. They should have just invented another character. It didn't need to be Marie Laveau. She arbitrarily decides to defy a treaty with actual violence at the drop of a hat. This is not like going to see her like some of the other witches did, and she kind of treated that as if it was defying the treaty, even though no one did anything. They just came to talk to her. Then she has the audacity to act like she was the victim when the Minotaur's head is sent to her. She has no regard for innocence. She doesn't care. She comes off as uncomfortably very, very racist. And her story has to be back-built so that we care at all about her, or view her as having any humanity at all. If we hadn't had any of those flashbacks, we would think that she was as much of a monster as anyone else. And the most telling thing of all, perhaps, is despite her supposedly vast powers, she cannot seemingly remove a mask casually draped over a man's shoulders and apparently just turns him into a Minotaur in full. Because that's totally a voodoo thing to do. Minotaurs are totally all over voodoo. Yeah. Cordelia. Bland character, bland portrayal, switches motivations suddenly and inexplicably. Contemptibly weak and stupid, never pays any attention to the girls until it suits her sudden plans. She also has a stripper name, Fox, with 2 X's. Are you serious? She can't seem to decide what her feelings for her mother are, or anyone else for that matter. She can't really ever decide to latch on to one thing or another. One episode she's all about having babies. The next episode she's all about telling her husband to fuck off. The next episode she's decided that she needs to protect witches everywhere. Well, it's great that she waited until the last minute when people were dying. Her entire image, though, is ripped off of Emily from Lucio Fulci's The Beyond. Look it up. It's as blatant as it gets. There's no reason for her suddenly to have visions and latch onto that like it's her only value in life. Especially since she suddenly becomes able to do anything. It's ludicrous, it's ridiculous, and it's trying to make a character more than they are. It's obvious that they just saw The Beyond, saw Emily, and thought that that was a really cool, compelling image. And they're right, it was. Emily was great in The Beyond. She was one of the major players in it, and the image of her is always going to be memorable from that film. Unfortunately, Cordelia neither has the acting talent nor the writing behind her to make her anything but a pathetic character that wastes gestures that people go to great lengths to do for her, and in the end it doesn't matter anyway. Delphine is another character that's problematically based on a real person. It would be more interesting if that character were given some sort of positive development that's consistent from the beginning, but it just turns her into a monster eventually anyway and does nothing of note with her. Like Queenie, she starts to develop, but unfortunately that goes nowhere. We become invested in her, and that investment is repaid by a slap in the face. She's reset into a state that is literally negative development. It's like rewinding a character, and the worst thing to do as a writer. You don't do that. Even if you make a character turn back evil, so to speak, you have to do it in a way where all the development that went up to that period isn't wasted. Unfortunately, on Delphine, it's completely wasted. She's all over the place, especially in the last episodes where they clearly didn't know what to do with her, but still, for some reason, wanted to have her in it. Kathy Bates is a fantastic actress, but any good actor can only do so much as the material allows. Delphine's character was horribly mishandled and should have been written out earlier if all they were going to do in the last few episodes was show that they had no idea what to do with her. The other cast tend to be basically glorified cameos. Most of them don't really make enough of an impression, but the ones that do tend to make a bad impression. Spaulding, the butler, comes off like the guy from Scary Movie 2. Any of you who have seen Scary Movie 2 and watched Coven, you know I'm right, and you probably thought this yourself. Hank is amazingly blander than Cordelia, and it's never clear whether his supposed suffering and conflict are supposed to be believable or not. He's such a bad actor that it's impossible to tell whether he really cares for Cordelia or if he's just crazy or stupid. Who knows? I didn't care. I didn't care about any part of him. He existed as a deus ex machina to move the plot into a place where the writer of the week wanted it to go. It was an extremely offensive place, and it ended up being completely superfluous too. I am not enchanted. The stereotypical fundamentalist neighbours are offensive down to the concept, and their storyline, like most of the others, goes literally nowhere. Why are they here? Because Patti LuPone is a good actress and they wanted to pad out the plot. Frankenbro is a distressing character concept in so many ways, but he's not played particularly well so as to give really any cause for us to care. It would be a more interesting character if they hadn't tried so hard and so obviously to backbuild something that we could latch onto and sympathize with. We ultimately don't really pity him that much because he doesn't really have enough of a personality to pity. He's also a zombie in a really shitty situation, surrounded by assholes that see him as a commodity. Like all the other male characters in the show, he's treated like an object. It's not okay. It's not okay to do that to any of the characters. And even some of the female characters are treated that way. They're essentially distilled down into objects, commodities, and that is never okay to do to a character. Also, that's not Papa Legba, and his fake accent is hilariously bad. Gambit from the 90s X-Men cartoon had a better and more convincing Cajun accent than Papa Legba in this series does, but he's not Papa Legba, so fuck that. The actors were a mixed bag. Jessica Lange, Frances Conroy, Kathy Bates, and Angela Bassett are noteworthy, even if they're wasted in their roles, and even if their roles were terribly inconsistently written and poor. Sarah Paulson, Taissa Farmiga, and Josh Hamilton stand out as not only the worst portrayals, but the very bottom of the barrel of characters, an unfortunate combination that makes the show seem worse than it is. It is torturous to see them on the screen, trying to deal with bad material and not having the acting chops to pull it off even slightly. These characters would be better either done away with or better cast. I know that some of them played in American Horror Story before, and I have not seen the earlier seasons, but I can only imagine that they surely must have done it better than they did this time. The setting is the city of New Orleans, which is a really magical place. I've been there, it's amazing. The magic of the city makes it an ideal place to set something that deals with magic. It's almost a character in and of itself, the glimpses that we're able to see of the setting. Unfortunately, like most of the best of the rest, it's sadly underused and we only get some faint window dressing every now and then. The Academy is where we spend most of our time, but it's bland. It's all white. It's totally bland decor. There's hardly anything on the walls. It makes it look like they found a house in New Orleans to shoot that was abandoned for years, and they just painted it white and went with it. Like they couldn't afford enough props, so they just put a few things in this room or that room, and that would be good enough. It didn't end up being eerie or weird. It just ended up being dull. You've heard the saying, dull as a beige room. Well, I'm going to change it to dull as Miss Robichaux's Academy. It was a really dull setting. Only the last opening sequence, the Stevie Nicks music video, made it look more interesting, which showed that they could do it, they just obviously didn't care to. Except for Cordelia's greenhouse, the whole place is very dull. And when Cordelia's greenhouse is so vivid, it makes it look even more like the set it is because of that contrast, and it shows what they could have done with the rest of the place. The Academy has no character except for a bland one, which I suppose matches most of the other characters. Aside from a few elements, really, the show could have been set just about anywhere. And as I mentioned before, as regards to the setting, there is a problematic passage of time, and it's indicated in the contrast with what people wear and what people do, and it just seems odd, as well as the foliage not matching. The soundtrack is fantastic. The opening is amazing, the sequence is amazing, of course, as I've said before, but the music they chose is just perfect. The soundtrack is very good overall. Everybody that worked on this should really be proud of themselves, except Stevie Nicks. It's somewhat disparate at times, but a good soundtrack doesn't necessarily have to keep to a single theme. There's still plenty of directly relevant music that adds to the atmosphere. And sadly, I have to say again, please, why did we have so much Stevie Nicks? I know they were trying to define Misty Day as a big fan and everything, and it would have been ironic and amusing if she had gotten into, the whole witchcraft thing, because Stevie Nicks was a witch, or supposed to be a witch, or whatever, and that would have been neat if it had been just a kind of ironic fangirl thing. But when they brought Stevie Nicks into it, it made it seem extremely awkward and just like a huge embarrassing waste of time. Like it's something that you would only think is a good idea if you're like 14 and think, yeah, we need a completely superfluous celebrity cameo. Like if you just didn't understand the concept of irony with a character, or that you didn't understand that it was much, much funnier and more amusing, and gave the character more depth, never to meet Stevie Nicks. I used to be a fan of Fleetwood Mac. Stevie Nicks is batshit crazy by now. It's sad to see her parading around a set where she can't act, she doesn't really know what's going on, and she has changed the lyrics or forgotten them to some of her most iconic songs. She can't even sing them in the same way anymore. Why did we have to parade her around in one of the saddest cameos ever? If you really wanted to do it, why not just do that last episode intro with her lip-syncing Seven Wonders and just have that be her entire appearance in the series? She did not need to be a glorified cameo in an episode that had her name in the title. It was embarrassing and it was shameful. And it's also really sad when, as someone who used to really love her music and thought that she was a neat person, to see what a kind of person she's become and to see her basically whore herself out for a cameo appearance on a really poorly written show. In conclusion, so many good ideas that are never developed or realized in any satisfactory way. Terrible, inconsistent writing saved only by the shining performances of some of the cast. It's amazing that the best of the cast did as well as they did with such shitty material, but the less able actors and random silly musical guests really demonstrate where the show went seriously wrong. It's okay to have a character who's a fan of Stevie Nicks, but that shouldn't be all she has going on. Additionally, you really shouldn't just have Stevie Nicks actually make a cameo and imply she has something to do with the witches community. It's just ridiculous. And on a practical note, she can't act. She's a musician, not an actor. I wish people would get this right. Celebrity cameos outside their medium always end up embarrassingly awkward. I don't know why they thought this would somehow be different. The character development was non-existent because every time a character threatened to advance in any meaningful way, it was either wiped away as if it had never happened, invalidated through clumsy writing, or ignored for a completely different characterization that came out of nowhere. When Queenie shows back up after being presumed dead for a significant amount of time, they play it off as a joke, which isn't altogether unexpected since death means nothing on this show, but it's kind of sad that they felt they had to lampshade it. It would have actually been kind of sad for Queenie to have died at that point, even though by then she was not the same person she was supposed to be, and in fact was pretty unlikable. But it would have made her death a tragedy for her to die, because in the end she gave her last moments of life to do something good and admirable, which should have affected Marie more than it did. But no, it's played off for laughs. In a way, that's kind of a metaphor for the show itself. Nothing really means anything, and the story never goes anywhere. So many aspects of it are complex issues. Racism, sexism, disease, pregnancy, murder, and exactly none of them are dealt with well at all. In many cases, it seems like the writers hadn't even done research on any of it and were just flying by the seat of their pants. They shouldn't have included these elements at all if they couldn't include them well. Oh, and again, that dude is not Papa Legba. GTFO. The series comes off as write as you go, which can work for stories, but it's essential that there be some kind of idea of a concrete series of milestones. You don't have to have a classic beginning, middle, end by the numbers thing if you want to try and be different and push the limits. That's okay. But this show seemed not to even have the faintest outline, and what they intended for the series kept changing every episode. It was clear that they had no idea what they wanted to do with characters like Delphine and Queenie, and it was just as clear that they didn't have any goal in mind to accomplish with the witch hunter and neighbour subplots. You can't do that and expect anyone to want to take the journey with you. It just seems like wasted time, and that's perhaps the most unfortunate part of it all. It's a time waster. There are some good ideas, there are some good performances, but the material is garbage. It's not funny enough to be a comedy, dark though it would be. It's not scary at all, which makes one question the horror story name, and it manages not even to pull off the cheap soap opera type elements it introduces when it introduces them. When you don't have an outline or any idea of even general milestones as you're getting from point A to point B, it leads to the kind of sloppy writing typified in Coven. And tying it back to the controversial elements I mentioned earlier, it's a bad idea to try and tackle things that could potentially offend if handled poorly, if you're not going to have a plan of how to address them. This is probably why the series overall comes off as uncomfortable in pretty much every way it can be, by mishandling every issue because they didn't actually have any idea how they wanted to address them. I have to give the show some credit, though. The premise was interesting. The first few episodes, if pretty sloppy, were a kind of guilty pleasure. I was interested in seeing where they took the characters and what they did with them. Unfortunately, I have to echo the sentiment of a friend who watched the series and, after hearing I was going to sit down and view it, voiced her disappointment with the series after the zombie attack on the school. It wasn't good before that, but it's a sharp downhill descent afterwards. I've never thought much of American Horror Story, but I've also never sat down and watched a season story arc through before. Now that I have, I can say it is definitely not for me. Not because I don't like horror. Actually, I'm a big horror fan. And I especially love seeing witches because they're so rarely used, and even more rarely used well. Nothing, however, about Coven is done well, and it's a shame because what could have been a fairly empowering and interesting story just ends up seeming at least mildly offensive, mindless, and on the surface at least, uninspired plagiarism of a comic book. And maybe that whole way of thinking is its downfall, since comic books tend to have rotating creative teams with characters changing sharply at times between one team and another. Maybe being essentially a comic book complete with jarring, silly, real-world celebrity cameos was Coven's greatest problem. If you think about it, it really does seem like a weird compressed comic series complete with revolving door creative teams. It's just more noticeable since it's a short television series, not a monthly serial running for years. Either way, Coven is a tragedy. Not in terms of story genre, but in terms of what it could have and should have been. I want to like American Horror Story, but it's one of those cases where it's just so little to like in comparison to the negative, and, eventually, nothing at all to appeal. X-Men Witches could have been and should have been a much more compelling and interesting story, but it just wasn't.